few things that I want to touch on this, just to kind of set us up for whatever discussion we want to have about it. I want to start on M. I'll read a little bit of the first part of the chapter and then a little bit at the end. These are two brackets of the chapter, so to speak, and each has to do with ideas about control, you'll see, and ideas about vulnerability. So sometimes I think we form images of ourselves, images of rational selves, that are far too impermeable. That is, the idea of the self, the boundaries of it, and the notion of exactly what it is are quite rigid. And that goes hand in hand with all the other kinds of things that we associate with intimately with ourselves. So that's why I think that when we think about what love is, we're also thinking about what we are, in part because just from the simple thought that we want to be loved for ourselves, the question is, what do we want to be loved for? And that's just the same question, in a sense, twisted as what it is. So let me just start at the beginning with an idea of St. Augustine's, which, again, I think sometimes when you take you look at one of these things, not as the theory being expressed, but as a use of the theory, then you think, what a strange thing to think, right? And so, for example, you see that in Kant's view on marriage, right? You think, gee, why would anybody? What would you have to be thinking in order for you to think that that was a great leap forward for mankind, right? Well, some strange background thought. And the same way, for example, when you discover the system of values that you're looking at, well, when you look at some parts of it, it seems just like what we think. So if you read the Nicomachean Ethics or parts of the Symposium or Phaedrus, you think, oh yeah, we think that too. But if you look at other parts, then you think, gee, how would you, if that's part of the picture, maybe I'm wrong about the other parts too. So I think two great examples for me are both so very different thinkers. But Kant, who was a sort of Lutheran Protestant by upbringing, right? And St. Thomas Aquinas, the great, obviously he's a saint, we know where he is from, as the great Catholic theologian who develops Aristotle. Both of them think the following. I've mentioned it before, but I just think it's a real shocker when you read it. It makes you think, what is the whole picture then if this is a part of it? That, masturbation is a more serious sin than the rape of a virgin. And you think, how did you get to think that? In the same way, I think when you see in Kant, you must never ever lie no matter what. You can think, no matter what? That just seems like a million will die if you tell the truth, right? The Nazis are there waiting to obliterate the whole city if there are any Jews in it. And they say, are there any Jews in this city? And you say, can't lie. Right, that just seems not like great ethics, it just seems like craziness. So let's take a case from another person influenced very much by Plato's, St. Augustine, another great Christian theologian whose influence on our thoughts, even if we're not Christian, it permeates our culture, almost as great as that of St. Thomas. This is what I said. For St. Augustine, involuntary responsiveness, the sort of thing that happens when boy meets girl, or girl meets girl, or boy meets boy, or whatever, and there's the hook, right, the flash of whatever it is, desire or interest, the Bluefoot phenomenon, right? That involuntary responsiveness, the fact that we can fall in love, is really something to be regretted, right? Because it's loss of control. We don't control it. And anything we don't control is really bad. So here's before Adam, this is St. Augustine, before Adam ate the apple, he had voluntary control of his erections. His penis could go up and down under the control of his will, something we all know. We who have penises, and probably those who've encountered them, though they don't have them, recognize to be false. And Eve presumably had control of her erections or wetness or whatever, her sexual response. She didn't just get it. She could decide when to have it. Afterwards, it was a different story. Once we were kicked out of the garden, I mean, just sort of imagine Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with voluntary control over their sexual responses, right? I mean, it's the stuff you could make a comic movie out of it, right? Right, depending on how these things were correlated. Afterward, it was a different story. Voluntary control was lost, but longed for. For Augustine, we regret it. That's why a true friend of wisdom, he says, would choose to beget children without orgasm. Since when the emotion of the mind is united with the craving of the flesh, it convulses the whole man, so that there follows a pleasure greater than any other, a bodily pleasure so great that at that moment of time when he achieves his climax, the alertness and, so to speak, vigilance of a man's mind is almost entirely overwhelmed. You think, isn't that part of the point? Right? So think about it. Well, same would apply to, say, having a glass of wine or two, right, in order to relax and in fact, decrease the vigilance of your mind, which might be inhibiting good things that you want to do, free conversation, open, right? And Augustine says, no, that's really bad. Adam was ever vigilant, even evidently, well, no orgasms in the Garden of Eden. That's starting to sound not like the Garden of Eden anymore, right? It's starting to sound kind of grim, right? Well, I don't know. I find these things hilariously funny. But, you know. I'm just sort of thinking how you do a movie of all of this, right? Why did they want? So they beget children. Why? What will incentivize them to do it? Right? They're not lonely the way God, well, before each had the other. So you sort of think about it. No sexual pleasure for the wise then, and no cold beer either, at least not very much. Rational control is too precious to give up even for an ecstatic moment. And you might think, do we really value any kind of control that much that we would never really? And the right question to ask is, I think, what is St. Augustine afraid of? Is control so great? I mean, just think about it. Well, partly it depends on the controller, right? I mean, if the controller is, so think of a tyrant who thinks, I want to control everything. The only trouble is, as Plato points out, part of what a tyrant can control are his own tyrannical impulses, wishes, and wants. Do we really want to be subject to that kind of control? It would all, if you thought that the control could be perfect, so that reason always got things right, then you might think control would be good. But part of what that is a fantasy about reason, that it can always get things right. Even reason gets things wrong, or can't be confident that it's getting them right. There's no control, and so you might think of this as an argument for sort of psychological democracy. Right? We want to be able to kick the bums out if it turns out that the control turned out to be really bad. Right? Democracy is good because, right, even though idiots select idiots, every now and again we can throw the idiots we elected out and elect another bunch of idiots, not the very ones we had before. That's one of the virtues of it. Because, so if you think about perfection, you think one way, hold it. If you think about we'll never get it, what you want to do is keep being able to correct your errors. You don't think we're going to always get it right. Anytime, we're always going to have to correct errors. So Augustine envies Adam and Eve. Homer, rightly in my view, is more circumspect. And this is a great little exchange that comes up in the Iliad. Despite the disaster involuntary sexual desire brought to the Greeks and the Trojans, remember it was Paris falling in love with Helen of Troy that launched, this was the face that launched 1,000 ships. He doesn't think that we should try to get rid of it. So I think, yeah, look what happened. Look, I'm going to tell you a big long story about what happened. It was pretty terrible. But my conclusion is not going to be, hey, let's get rid of that. It's bad. Right? When Hector is berating Paris for the troubles he's brought on the Trojans, the issue is explicit. No, don't stand up to Menelaus. You might find out what kind of man it is whose wife you're sleeping with. You think your lyre will help you, or Aphrodite's gifts, your hair, your pretty face when you sprawl in the dust. That's the brother of Paris talking to him. It's a devastating criticism, I think, right? But it's to Paris that Homer awards the more devastating reply. That's only just Hector. You've got a mind like an axe, you know, always sharp, making the skilled cut through a ship's beam, multiplying force. Nothing ever turns your edge. But don't throw golden Aphrodite's gifts in my face. We don't get to choose what the gods give us, you know, and we can't toss their gifts aside. Right, that's a great response, it seems. Maybe it's true. Nobody would choose some of these things. This is a paradox of rational choice. Maybe if you were looking at all these things and making an objective choice of them, you wouldn't choose them. But if you get them, you wouldn't throw them away. So you might think of this, right? So if you ask most parents if they would like to have an exceptional child or a genius as a child, they'll say no, right? Because they recognize the difficulties and complexities involved in bringing up a genius child. But if they get one, they don't drown them, right? Right? Or give it away, right? And it's empowering, I think, to think again, that when we think about control, and we think about having control, we also have to recognize that a large number of really good things enter our lives precisely because we can't control. If we control everything, right, it wouldn't be better. We'd lose a lot of value, even if we gain some value, too. So that's very important to kind of keep that in mind. And love is one of those things that, you know, so when we're thinking about it, right, one of the things we recognize is that it does involve loss of control. It involves vulnerability. Suddenly your life is rejigged, and now someone is very important to you. That comes with risk. They may dump you, they may die, a million things may happen as a result of your having hooked up with them in this way. And yet, you're right, most of us wouldn't think, okay, so let's get rid of love then, because look at the costs. And in part because the benefits are real too, but there are risks and all kinds of other things attached to it, and we can't get rid of the risks without getting rid of the benefits. You might think of this very generally because it doesn't just apply in these cases, it applies in many other cases. So, for example, think of naturally sort of helicopterish parents worried about sending their beloved little offspring out into the harsh, cold world of the university, where who knows what will happen to them, right? It's very easy to imagine that you can have all the benefits of that without any of the risks. And this especially applies to, I think, to women, for whom the risks are greater in lots of areas, but also who are now just beginning to fully explore their freedoms and think about what's involved in them. Part of the worry is that whether you can have the freedoms without the attendant risks, are they worth it? It's not always this, that you can have all the freedoms, well, none of the risks. Right? So if you could just have to think about it. It doesn't tell you, it doesn't say this. We shouldn't do anything about the risks, right? That's nonsense too. We can lower the risks. But if you think about driving on the freeway, it's a very risky business. But we limit the risks in all kinds of ways by having rules of the road, rules about drunken driving, rules about all kinds of things. Even with all those rules in place, shit happens, and that's hard sometimes to deal with. You hate the world in which your children have all just been killed in a car crash, right? But at the same time, you also recognize that, maybe nobody was really at fault. Or maybe it was your children who were at fault. That doesn't really matter. I think we need to think of life, about risk management in life, far more generally than we do. I mean, more people die in the bathroom than die on the freeway. But that doesn't stop us from taking showers or going to the bathroom or whatever. But at the same time, it does make us think that as we get older, maybe we should put a safety bar in the shower, or we should have an emergency button, or a whole lot of other things of that sort. That won't get rid of all the risks, but it'll get rid of some, yeah.
Something we talked about last time was like the individual and that kind of thing, and I wonder if this kind of like modern neurosis about like maintaining people's life potentially infinitely, or like kind of... It
certainly plays a role. And in fact, in a way, let me just read the last part of the chapter, which you'll see is about this very thing in a way, about how that plays out when we start thinking about, right, not about the activities that selves engage in, but about the selves that engage in those activities. So I'll fill in a little bit of the details if we get to them in discussion, but but let me just put this little last bit. A mother's love for her child attaches his mirror image to him, right? The way that he comes to see himself reflected by his mother, but with a twist. It attaches it to him as someone he wants to be, not as someone he is. For the cohesiveness, integrity, and clarity he sees in the image actually conflict with his sense of dependence and lack of coordination. Then he learns language. He learns to use the word I, not only in place of the inner self-image, but also in place of baby, an actor in the public drama of life. So the word acquires a kind of shifting reference for him. It's who he really is, who he wants to be, and who they, the other players of language, say he is and want him to be. You forces an acknowledging I. The linguistic unity of the word I, its grammatical identity, is like the tantalizing but illusory integrity and clarity of the mirror image. Just as there are files attached to the word love in our inner dictionary, and I want to come back to that in discussion, there are similar files attached to the word I, a word we set up, Nietzsche claims, at the point at which our ignorance begins, at which we can see no further. Somewhere among those files are the theories of experts on the I, psychologists, psychiatrists, philosophers, priests. So the question of who I am falls under the sway of whichever of them happens to have authority where and when I speak. When priests were oracles, or rationalist philosophers, I was my immortal soul, or my rational part, my spiritual self. Now I'm something else. Who I am is as much and as little under the authority of others as what love is, and what I must do if I am to love. In our wanting to be loved, it's not obvious, it's not only isn't obvious what we want to have happen, it isn't obvious to whom we want to have it happen. So that's the two sets of thoughts. You're quite right, I think. But what's true is you can think of first your mother and then society in general as reflecting back to you, but not without control. It reflects back to you a normative image of who you are. It says, this is who you are as a mix of what you are and what you ought to be. So we can think about this in all kinds of cases, right? The one would be that when you have a little boy child, you reflect him back little ways to be a boy. And when you have a little girl child, you reflect back to her ways to be a girl. And these ways to be boys and girls are societally valenced. Oh, good. So this is what it is to be a girl, a successful girl, successfully a girl, in the world in which the social roles of girls are these. Right? And that's a pressure on you to sort of see yourself. The integrity that we feel for the self, the idea, this Freud's picture I think is quite right. Our image of ourselves, he says, a bodily ego. We think of ourselves as being like the image we see of ourselves in a mirror, which is a coherent outline shape of a body. But that's a very misleading image because it suggests a kind of unity and coherence to ourselves that in fact once we start thinking about how we acquire the correlative inner I, we realize it's very different. Yeah?
I loved, and I wrote it down separately, I think earlier in Love's Confusion, you quoted Nabokov about how one of
the space helmet one from
the space helmet, and how human beings are discrete, and it's kind of, I think it was after you referenced Kant. But what I thought you were going to say in relation to girls earlier, you said, the risks of love are high, your loved one can die or fall ill, but you kind of said, but the benefits are just as high. But what I kind of was saying you were going to say is that for women, the risks are higher and the benefits are lower. Yeah,
that seems right.
And so how are we convincing, how do we keep convincing women to be in relationships or loving relationships if this seems so obvious?
Yeah, well, I think, so you're right. Again, I think the thought is always the costs of not following the social norms are also very high. So it's not it's actually quite hard to do the cost-benefit analysis. So, I mean, the costs of rebellion are very high. First, you have to organize. Certainly, the other is that it won't happen without there being a pushback. The status quo has a kind of gravitational pull, but it also has a lot of force at its fingertips. And when it sees a rebellion occurring, all kinds of reactions come in. So, think about the contraceptive abortion wars in our own society. These are in part about the preciousness of little babies, but a lot of it was about the control of women and about putting them back in a place they were before and keeping them there. So that's a pushback, even though there was a massive pro women's liberation kind of movement that generated the pushback. So I think that what we want to do is say something like this, that when the society is when there's a structural asymmetry, so men do better than women, that structural asymmetry carries forward into everything. To change the structural asymmetry is complicated, but there are all kinds of ways to subvert it slightly to your benefit, even if you can't change the structural relation easily. But then there's another one, which is you change the structural relation.
Like the Swedish children's.
Yeah, that's one. And then I think the other one is just by consciousness raising, actually by understanding that the thing is pitched against you in a certain way, right? You're already not being simply accepting it as a part of nature. You're thinking, this is something that needs to be changed. And then, I'm just thinking of friends whose mothers were at the forefront of early feminist things, who would say to their daughters, no, I'll do the washing up. You will study. You don't want to end up doing this. You want to end up doing something else. It's too late for me. It's not too late for you. So I'm going to take on some costs to benefit you. That's a very simple example. But in fact, that's a way, part of it is you don't bring up your children to play exactly the same role you do. You use your own knowledge to pass on a benefit to somebody that you care about. That's a quiet rebellion and subversion. I think the other is that you find a partner who's on your side, and you try very hard to develop, at least within your relationship, a greater equality and parity. And in large part, that's a consciousness-raising effort. It's a two-way street of not simply living out the roles that the drama assigns to you, but actually becoming the dramaturges of your own lives, right? You change the drama, even if it's only in rather small ways, so that children don't see mom only cooking and dad only mowing the lawn or whatever the hell it is. But you tell them a lot about it and show them that there's a different and better way to be alive than the one that society throws you as the norm.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't think we can overstress individual autonomy in thought outside of the structural conditions. Yeah. It's very why is it that we have feminism occur in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and all this kind of huge amount of human history that which feminism didn't really present in anywhere near the way it did in the West then. It's I think you have to do a critical analysis.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. So remember the sort of response I had was there are these structural political things, and that requires movements like I think the Me Too movement, right, and the early suffragette movements that got the vote for women show us that the status quo can be changed. Part of what we understand is the status quo, it's the way things are, right, are responsive in all sorts of ways to costs. And if you can get the costs high, you can force change. That's one of the ways that political change occurs. And while it's expensive for you to start a movement, the expense goes down as the movement grows, right? So if there are 5 women who are rebelling, it's expensive to join the group because, right, your chances of being effective are small and the upfront costs are large. You're going to have to be an active activist. But when it's 100 million women, you actually don't have to do much to add to the bulk and benefit. Maybe it's just now that you contribute some money to the movement because the movement's organized, it's got an office, it's got a way of utilizing the money that you give it in an effective way. So we want to do both, it seems to me, right? We want to commit ourselves to a better polis, a better political system than we've got. But at the same time, we don't have to simply accept it. There's quiet rebellion, internal emigre status, in which you refuse to accept many of the values. That's right. So you don't eat fast food, for example. You don't consume in the way. You don't embody these values. You don't see yourself as climbing the corporate ladder. You don't strive for a certain kind of success. You do something else. Yeah, I think I saw a hand.
Oh, never mind. I was just gonna, I was kind of related. There's like this article, I think it's written in the early 2000s by Linda Hirschman, and she writes about like ways in which like women to lessen sort of the asymmetry in marriage should like choose partners who are younger than them, significantly lower earning, and sort of like to change the power balance, not just by like refusing to do some domestic things, but sort of like viewing partner selection as political instead of just about.
That's I mean, there's a terrific film about this view. It's a very good film to watch. It's fun too. It's by a terrific French director, I think Laurent Saint-Say. I'll just tell you right up front. I've taught it a few times in class. It's a very, it's called Heading South. And that's on DVD. You can download it. It's probably on Netflix and other things too. But it's a very good film. And he's a political filmmaker, but they're dramas. They're not documentaries. And one of the things he does exactly to take your picture, which is so there's an age injustice. Ageism affects women far more than it affects men. High status older males have younger female partners. It's more difficult for high status older females to have younger males. But if you go to third world countries, right, and it's not, it is, Kante is very sensitive about the issue about a new kind of exploitation of the third world. But it is precisely about women, wealthy and successful women from quite different countries and different kinds of backgrounds who go to Haiti to have summer romances with very attractive younger men whom they also benefit in all kinds of ways. And I think one of the things that, it's a very subtle, if you watch it, you'll see it's a very subtle film. But I think part of the thought is, right, when men do that, and they do it all the time, right, they buy the kind of sex they want from the women they want, and different ways of buying it. We have a slightly different attitude, considerably different attitude to women doing it. But as women gain the same kinds of power, so the way you put it, it could also sound that, right? You actually replicate, but invert, subverting the exploiting structure. You become the man relative to the woman. And that was a real worry about an early feminist, that really what you were getting was the right to be men, not to be women. But now you could play the male role, right? And that didn't sound too much better. But I think when the pendulum is swinging, you have to have a different view about what swings too far in one direction than we would if it were sort of slowing down. So what you want to think is, yes, there's nothing wrong with directly having those relations that actually show possibilities that are quite different from the dominant ones. Yes?
So Lily's question was, how do we get to, ask actually the women, would they be really loving in the relationship? And with all of that said, when you look at the reality, I mean, maybe it's not even, the answer is we don't get them, we coerce them. We don't really get them to be, equal. So with all of this said, yes, there's a movement, yes, but they don't get the same.
Well, but I don't think
the
that's,
answer is
that's
you
not
don't
a,
get that.
that's not a they can't get or they won't get it, it's they haven't gotten. That's true, though, with all of the great efforts, women have not achieved equality. But the movements haven't stopped.
I know that.
And the equality, I agree. I think some neutral group did a calculation of when women would achieve financial parity with men, and the estimate was 300 years. So that's a pretty depressing number, but that's a projection that doesn't allow for the kinds of things like Me Too. So the Me Too movement doesn't start this way. It didn't start because there was seeds of it growing and developing. It happened around a certain kind of provocative event that resonated with a lot of people. It had a particularly egregious example. And then people came out of the woodwork, so to speak, to join the group, and it got momentum because of the capacity we have with modern media to broadcast these things. And a lot of things have to happen. No predictor ever gets all of these things right. I mean, nobody ever predicted the web or the kind of influence that media would have. Yet those have transformed the world. So even though what we ought to think, I think, is that these movements, we do have to commit ourselves to them, and we have to take such action as we can. It's always part of the dominant culture to try to tell you that all rebellion will be fruitless. That's part of the ideology, right? It says, don't bother putting your efforts into these things. Be downhearted because, look, nothing is ever going to change. You're actually better off the way you are. You were better off the way you were before. But that's intended to make you despair. That's not intended to be the truth about it. Okay, so you're right, Lily, I think, about the idea of that women do pay a higher cost. And in a way, you have to do something to try to change that. So my thought about women in the university is similarly, right? Women do run greater risks now that they've gained a kind of freedom and so forth, and they don't have chaperones looking out for them all the time the way they used to. They've gained a freedom. The playing field is tilted against them. We can do something simultaneously to keep their freedom and untilt the playing field, and we certainly have to do that. Can I pick up on a few other little bits from this chapter? So this is, I've thought of it as, anyway, I put a lot of work into this chapter, in part because I wanted to touch on a lot of very complicated issues, but just very gently. I wanted to paint a picture without getting lost in the detail. And I want to just say a little bit about the way a kind of model, if you like, about how our understanding of everything, ourselves, the world, love, you name it, it's kind of roughly a model for a good way to think about that. I think that, so a way to think of it is that we develop, and this is a fact about us that's often forgotten by philosophers who don't remember that they were little babies that needed to be brought up by attendant adults. Right? They sort of, you want to think where the rational self appears, when exactly, evidently it doesn't have any much need for upbringing and so on, it's just there. But we learn everything in circumstances of massive dependence on another person. We're helpless. We're not, so unlike infants or offspring in other species, we're not able to be autonomous pretty much from the get-go. Our gestation, the time we spend in the womb, is only really one small part of our gestation. We're not quite marsupials, right, where a baby's put in a pouch, but if you think that it takes us, right, it takes about 7 or 8 years before we're independent enough even to walk around and feed ourselves and so forth, do all those things, and learn a language, be part of it. That's a very long period in which we're dependent on the goodness of and the love of other people, especially our first caregiver, because typically our mother, but increasingly it's two parents or whatever. But that's very important, because what we're learning about love, because we learn it in circumstances of dependence, continues to have in it those dependent roots. It continues to embody aspects of our dependence. I mean, look at the fact that, right, here's a big issue. You can't be sure that anyone will ever love you, no matter how how wonderful you are. It may be that you just don't, in fact, attract anybody's love. And that can be a disaster. I mean, a terrible thing for you. But there's very little you can do about it. You don't have a right to be loved. There's a dependence on others even later on. And that dependence, when your life depends on it, right? If your mother doesn't take care of you, you die. There's that sense of loss that you can feel when your lover leaves you, right, or a relationship breaks up. That kind of, like that gut, I mean, it's very hard to describe, but it's very awful when it happens, right? The sense that your life has been kind of emptied out, there's nothing left. That's itself the root coming from that early experience. Because once upon a time, that was real. You would die. And I think that it's an area in which if we want to understand the phenomenology of our emotions, what they feel like, we actually have to look back at those early roots. We can't explain why the loss of love should seem so devastating. Right? Even if we can sort of do this as our friends often do, don't worry, there are other fish in the sea. Oh, she wasn't that great anyway. Or, look, everybody knew it wasn't going to work. There's a whole big load of triage that we engage in. And in my experience, none of it works. Right? The level at which you've experienced the loss is immune to these kinds of arguments. Eventually, as you say, if you're lucky, you get over it. Right? But you don't cure it. It just, as it were, you put tissue on top of it until it's not as awful as it was. And that's a very important fact in thinking about ourselves. That our minds are the minds that develop from these early minds that we have when we were babies. And that's not just about it's about emotional functioning or mental functioning. So this is something, again, that philosophers have been very slow to pick up on, but psychoanalysts and others have studied very carefully, which is infantile thought is a thinking process. It's a way of thinking that we never abandon, even though we replace it or layer on top of it kinds of thinking that are much more, as we say, rational. And part of what that means is they're able to respond to evidence, they're able to construct complex lines of argument, they're typically verbal, they're evaluable as true or false. But infantile thinking is more like dreaming. It's not subject to these kinds of constraints or reality constraints. It's much more modeled as people think now. And there's lots of evidence for this, kind of interesting. I could go on. I try to keep it short. It's much more modeled on eating and excreting, taking things in and pushing them out. It's got two thoughts, right? One is the nice things you want to take in. The other is the nasty things you want to push out and get rid of. And if you think about the way that our emotions work, you can see, if you reflect on yourself, you can watch yourself engage in infantile thinking. One of the ways you do it is when you simply can't bear to think about something. That when you try to think about it, it just flies away from you. You find you're unable to hold it in your mind and look calmly and carefully at it. It's too awful. You push it away, right? But the other is there are things that you hold on to, right? You cling to, even though there's no good reason in particular to do so. States you like to be in that you want to be in. I think that growing up, that there's a myth about what it is to be a grown-up. One is that there is such a thing, apart from just something that gets older, right? But we have it, right? We sort of think of children and grown-ups. But really, where do you draw that line? I mean, you can be a 65-year-old infant when it comes to the way you deal with the world and think about it. We all know people like this. We may be governed by people like this. Right? I mean, sort of big babies who just can't tolerate criticism, can't tolerate anything, have massive, right, violent reactions to any kind of opposition. They're like little babies, right? So we don't want to draw the line this way, as if by the time you're 15 or 17 or 7 or whatever, all of this has changed, and now you've reached the use of reason, as we say in one line. Now you're a grown-up. We all know that's just drawing crude lines for government bureaucratic purposes. It doesn't actually tell you anything. If we ever have an adult test, right? I always said an adultery test, a test for adultness, right? You wonder how many adults there would be in the world. Right? It would be much smaller than the number of people over 21. We can be confident of that. So that's there's a thought about the way our minds, our loving selves, the selves that we're going to do our loving with, and the ways in which we're going to understand what it is to be loved, have these dimensions that are, as I want to say, infantile. They stem from that early self. So think about, it's very easy to forget, but think about all the things that lovers like to do. Right? Think about kissing, for example. I mean, from a certain point of view, kissing is a really weird thing to do. I mean, if you were just in the abstract thinking, so I'm going to put those next to those, and then maybe I'm going to put my tongue. These are not things that you would just come up with in the abstract. And as for the rest, I'm sure, I don't know if you remember how you first learned about how reproduction occurs in human beings, but I remember it very vividly because I was about 6. And I went to an all-boys school, and I was in the men's room peeing next to my friend Liam Sexton, who was also peeing. And he said out of the blue, "Do you know where babies come from?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, my brother told me." Then he gave an exact description. He was right. But it was so unbelievable that I just thought it was complete nonsense. I thought, oh, that's ridiculous. Your brother's just fooling you. That's absolutely stupid, right? Can I tell you one more such story? So again, everyone had older brothers and sisters and so forth. But if an older brother went to medical school, and remember this was before the web, and you couldn't just see photographs of things to figure out how everything was. So younger boys, and we were probably about 11 or 12 now, we wanted to know what girls' genitals were like because we'd never seen any. Right? And here's a guy who's actually looked at them and cut them open and done all kinds of things. He must know a lot. So this is how it started. So what are women's genitals like? And he said, well, there are these 3 holes. And everybody cracked up with laughter and said, okay, that's it. We weren't going to take that seriously. Well, there are 3. But if you're a little boy and you've been thinking about this, that just seems like preposterous. Anyway, that's how we responded to it. So, I mean, what I want to say here is that, right, these facts about the things we do when we're being lovers, that we kiss, that we touch, kiss genitals, that we put one part of our body into another, that certain parts of our bodies that otherwise are not in play suddenly gain a focus. These too are part of, right, our initial infantile upbringing. It's because, as we don't remember, we forget, the toilet training and the focus on control of our urethra and so on, these become very important parts of our socialization. Like our mouths, which have developed neural networks because we have to learn how to suck, we come actually equipped. That's the first epistemic engine for a baby, is the mouth. They explore the world with their mouth. That's why they like to put things in their mouth. It's not just this, they have a mouth and they think, I think I'll put things in. It's that they actually have lots of neural networks connecting their very sensitive lips and tongue and so on to neural networks in the brain that makes that a very good. They don't see very well yet. They don't hear very well. They don't have muscle control, right? But they are able to control their mouths, and their sucking mechanisms are very well developed. The same is true for other things. Learning how to control when you go to the bathroom is a major drama for children. Right? And in fact, a lot of their fantasies are built around this. They get rewards for being good at it. They get, right? And a lot of their dreams and fantasies revolve around it. And that doesn't, even though we grow up, a lot of our fantasies still revolve around those things that were so important when we were children. Again, if we look at the expert, I have lots of stories about this, but I'll just tell you one. So two friends of mine had a little girl. She was the perfect child. She did everything right, it seemed. She didn't cry, she slept, they loved it. Then they decided to have another child, and they had a little boy. And as soon as the daughter got a little brother, she became an enfant terrible. Right? And the way that she did it was, she refused to have bowel movements. She refused to go to the bathroom. Right? No matter, and one of the reasons was, here's the little brother getting all this attention, right? Everybody's so excited about his going to the bathroom, nobody cares about me anymore. Okay. Well, she wasn't, of course, thinking this way, but the result was, she had what's known as, I never heard of this before, but you can Google it now, stool hoarding syndrome. Don't you? She absolutely refused, and then she created dramas that would go like this. I think I can go now. Everybody gets excited, right? They all have parents, oh, maybe it's over. They rush to the bathroom. She sits on the toilet. Nothing. Everybody's focused on this now. She's the center of attention, right? Now the whole family has to go to see a child therapist. How do we get this problem to solve? It's not simply this. It's not a medical problem with her. She's fine. It's that she's learned there's something she can control, namely when she goes to the bathroom. And by being able to control that, she can extend the realm of her control to the whole family, right? Great. New powers have been developed, and with a new kind of understanding and intelligence that actually serves her to get exactly what she wants, right? A lot of attention. And then everybody, the whole family, goes to see the therapist, and they all have to understand that this is not just her problem, it's their problem too. And they have to, well, I rest my case. The same is true. We don't all get stool hoarding syndrome, thank goodness, right? But the parts of our bodies that have been the focus of these kinds of attentions remain in various ways players in the realm of eros because they start as being players in the realm of eros, right? If you like, the fact that we like to do certain kinds of things, right? The fact that we get pleasure from them, that we find it consoling, that we find it satisfying, these stem from the fact that we were these little tiny creatures. If we hadn't been, some of these things would be completely bizarre and mysterious. We wouldn't understand why they were players in the theater of eros at all. So that's the thought. And once you get there, you realize that we have to think of our minds as kind of layered. Right? It's not that growing up is not replacing one layer with another. It's putting a layer on top of another layer. So we might think of this as the infantile layer, and then the child, and then the adult. We'll just call them this, even though, or teenager. We can have lots and lots of layers. But what happens is that each one of these layers kind of persists. It isn't. Its role isn't to disappear as the new layer is added. It rather stays around and sometimes, right, gets galvanized when something happens to put us back into that early stage, right? The upper layer can be dominated by the lower one. It's not just that the control goes down, it can go up too, right? It goes in both directions. So sometimes, sure, you've all experienced it. We are just like children. We behave that way. We get really upset. We cry. We have tantrums. We feel homicidal thoughts towards somebody who's, annoying us or getting in the way. We feel like, I could kill you, I could kill you. Those kinds of thoughts come up. Even though in some level or not, we recognize we're not going to kill anybody. Right? That's not it. And yet we feel a fury, right, that makes it And our minds go, whoa, like this, and we can't still under like a buzzing, boiling confusion of stuff. Yeah.
No, there is a little dialogue between two girls,
Yeah.
2 and 4 years old.
Yeah.
One is saying to the other, "Don't touch my sand." They're playing in a
Yeah.
sandbox. "If you will, I'll kill you."
Yeah.
And the other one,
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
being scared, "I'm gonna kill you myself."
I'm what?
I'm gonna kill you myself. So I'm gonna kill you first.
Oh, I
actually,
see.
this-
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. Actually, the 4-year-old was probably in a better position to do the killing than the 2-year-old.
And it's not.
But
She doesn't
I'm
get
sure
excited or
I'm sure
anything.
you've seen
but
it.
very
You've
calmly.
seen children try to kill each other. Oh, you wait till you're a mother or you have some children around. You'll see it. You can.
After this.
I've seen with an axe, right? Well, partly because they don't understand. It's not like this. They know what an axe. They know what an axe can do, and they know that thing is. And you say, darling, put the axe at it. It's okay. Here, play with this and stuff. Yeah. Of course, yeah. Man,
This is
partly.
your daughter?
Look, I tell you, it's not just children. Wire-haired fox terriers are like those too. So, wire-haired fox terrier, very princess-like, very smart, loved and adored by the whole family. Ate only Swiss chocolate. I'm not ate other things, but of chocolate only Swiss. Right? And she would actually, if you gave her other kinds, she would just hold it in her mouth and then she would let it fall out. She wouldn't even spit it out. It wasn't worth the effort of spitting out. It would just fall out. So everyone loves this. She's always the center of fuss and attention. And so Susie was just great. One day, a young mother comes with her little daughter, about maybe 6 months old, crawling around. And everyone was cooing at the little daughter. And then when they look away, Susie walks in the group and opens her mouth like this around the neck of the baby, right? I was like, that thing is getting too much attention. It's time for it to go. Okay, so we do make a joke. Susie, bad dog. Then the mother and the little girl go to the bathroom, and Susie goes to outside the bathroom and sits there growling. Don't let those things back out. They get far too much attention. We're like this too. We have these sides of us, right? And if we watch it, and we don't just erase it because it's uncomfortable, right? We just see it as, just think of all the stuff that fits across your mind in a day. And you'll find murderous thoughts and other kinds of things in there too, even though you're not going to murder anybody, right? And that's part of what that's what we're like. We should just face up to it. It's not too surprising. And then in occasions, especially intimate ones, where many of the controls that society exerts are lessened, those are both occasions for wonderful things, but they're also occasions for terrifying things, because in these, when we're free of the I that watches us, and the other person is now like a part of us, there are intimate, our constraints and controls are lower. That's a good thing. But sometimes what comes out when they're lower is very unattractive. Okay. So we've got these different layers, and then when we think about, so let's start in here, we sort of imagine that whatever there is for the infant is this. And then that gets replaced by love up here, and that becomes subject to all kinds of social, and this is not just here, but we'll pretend that they're entering at the level of those. Where love goes in you, what you think about when you love, what it means to you, what you find essential, that without this it wouldn't be love. Right? The pull on the love, think of it as a gravitational field, or where it goes, where your thoughts go. So think of free associating, right? As we call it. It's not particularly difficult, but think about what you think about not when you think I'm going to write a love story, but when you think about love, and you just sort of free associate, you just think about all the things that go into it. What you think is not adventitious. So it happens according to plots and plans that you're unaware of. And you see more of where these thoughts come from. Because your individuality is in part that you have a very distinctive history. Only you were that child in that family then. Take two sisters, even twins, very different experiences. Why? Well, one was the first twin, one was the second twin. One thought that she was the favorite of Daddy, the other felt inferior, didn't think so. We're starting two different trajectories, even though the starting points seem very close together. That fact that what it is to be an individual is not to be a little atom, right, with a space helmet, a little circle. It's to have that distinctive formation that now has left behind in you all these traces, right? So that when you come to do any of these things, it's all of these traces from your past are activated. So part of it, so that's you. And when you enter into a loving relationship with another person, you're entering into a relationship that's, right, as individualized as those two histories make the two partners. And sometimes aspects of the relationship hide a large part of those, only to have them emerge there. So you've got a huge repository, far more than you'll ever spill out at once. But over time in a relationship, different aspects of that core set of things come out and are become immensely salient. So maybe they're not salient at first, but they become salient as the relationship continues. Maybe, for example, the having of children is always a big jolt for a couple, no matter how much they want children and how prepared they think they are for it. Because it reorients the entire relationship, and sometimes wire-haired fox terrier-like jealousies emerge, especially on the part of new fathers, right? They suddenly feel that they're not important anymore. Well, it's the child that's important. And all mom's attention goes to the baby, and I'm not getting any attention anymore. It almost, that seems jealousy towards children. It's very common. And Alice, even if they don't, of course, act on it, but it colors the drama for them. Okay, that's what I wanted to say, to think about. So I tried to put a sort of simplified model on that, and you'll notice the themes, right, about control on both ends, right, and the dangers of overdoing notions like the unity of the self or the stability of the self. We need to think about a kind of flexible set of opennesses, right? It's not as if it's all closed in. Everything comes from close. We're permeable to some extent. Yeah.
This is sort of like a more like non-theoretical question,
yeah.
But do you understand, like, I guess, like the Western ego as like significantly more than other cultures, or do you think that there's more of like a universal biological ego concept of self?
I think there are biological contributions in all cultures, and those biological contributions are very significant. But what cultures make of those is very different. So one thought is, suppose your conception of reality, of social reality, is like Margaret Thatcher's, right? There's no such thing as society. They're just individuals. So, you can think of, standard classical economics. You're a little consumer. You're the unit I should be looking at, and I'm one. And we're in competition with each other for certain kinds of resources and goods. we're in competition for wages, we're trying to, so if we think that we're going to be the selves that will be successful members of a consumer society, the aspects of us that tend to be, as we would say, more individualistic or more selfish or more, those will get amplified. If we're in a different one, suppose we're, for example, growing up in a cooperative rice farm in rural China, where nobody can harvest rice by themselves or sow it. It's impossible, and you can't even get machines to do it. It has to be a collective enterprise. Then aspects of the collectivity and your capacities to integrate with others and work cooperatively and win their support are going to be far more dominant than your capacities to compete or win. Why? Well, hey, listen, it's rice farming. You can't even play rice farming by yourself, right? You've got to play it with a big bunch of other people that you're cooperating with. So that's a very simplified model, right? But it gets across that we should always, so the answer to your question is, I think that the kinds of selves that are produced in, roughly speaking, sort of first world countries where market economies play a major role in determining life options and chances. We tend to be more, as we'd say, individualistic. And another reason is that the social bonds that bind us to each other are challenged and threatened by the market. So one of the biggest migrations in the world occurs every year in America. It's a migration of workers from one place to another following their jobs, following work. It's huge. Americans move more than in first world countries than anybody else. Well, when people move all the time, they have a very different notion about community and other things than if they don't, right? So, when I go home to Ireland, I have friends who sleep in the bedrooms they slept in when they were children, and you know what I mean? They do what their parents did. They live on the same street. They've never lived anywhere else. They've always lived in the same house. They've never moved around very much. In traditional societies, that's much more common, even in very developed ones. That builds a very different sense of belonging. It increases the number and richness of the connections that you have to a place, to other people, right? So that you've got a much larger set of things to rely on if something goes wrong. So you sort of thought as the neighbors will take help. Right? That won't happen here. But now think of a place where you don't know anybody, where you've just lived there for a while. Everybody else is like that too. Nobody's really been there for very long. You tend to look for things you already know. So look, there's a restaurant that's just like the one. There's a mall that's got the same things they have at home. You look for far more of that, big signs, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to find your way around.